Hello, this is Kyle Welch with RCR Wireless News. I want to thank everyone for joining Digital Transformation, a bitwise evolution for the telecommunications industry, presented by Deloitte. Our presenter today is Ganesha Rasia, Senior Manager, Telecommunications, Media and Technology at Deloitte Consulting. Just a reminder to everyone in the audience that within 24 hours of this webinar, we will provide you with a link to the on-demand recorded version of today's webinar. During the webinar, we encourage everyone to submit their questions via the control panel, which will be answered at the end of the presentation. With that being said, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Ganesha.
Thank you, Kyle. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on which time zone you are. Welcome to the webinar on the topic of digital transformation, a bitwise evolution for the telecommunications industry. My name is Ganesha Rasia, and I lead our digital practice within telecommunications, so within the wireline, wireless sectors, and equipment vendors here at Deloitte Consulting. And you'll notice that the topic of the conversation today is a bitwise evolution, i.e. a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek description for those engineers out there, really to draw the correlation between digital and binary representation as it relates to our main topic of conversation today, which is digital transformation. From an agenda perspective, we will cover today what is digital transformation, a definition of some of the piece parts, but also in a broader sense, what do we mean by digital transformation when we refer to it in the context of the overall marketplace and the business. Number two, we'll talk a little bit about digital across industries, specifically within the telecom sector, but we'll also draw a comparison against some of the other large sectors that we have out there, just to get a sense for where everyone's headed relative to the telecom sector specifically. Number three, we'll talk a little bit about the digital consumer, really to understand the nature of consumer behavior, how it's evolved, and the level of sophistication that we are dealing with today as it relates to digital consumers. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about opportunities within our sector, specifically telecom. What are the trends in the industry? What are some of the maturity elements that have prevailed over time? And what might be a path to get to what one would consider a digital-centric and really a digitally enhanced operating model for telecom. And at the end, of course, we'll open it up to questions, and we'd love to hear, as Les said here, we'd love to hear the burning questions that you might have on this topic. With that, let's get right into it. So digital transformation. So what we'll do here is we'll talk about what is digital, and from a purist view, digital simply means a numerical representation of information, whether it's binary, hexadecimal, et cetera, but it's a numerical representation of information intended to codify, simplify consumption of data. That's ultimately what digital means. Transformation, on the other hand, simply means a large-scale change, so synonymous with the metamorphosis that we've highlighted here pictorially. But really, it's intended to describe a significant, massive change, typically driven by a multitude of different catalysts, a multitude of different events that have come together to drive a significant change. But in the context of what we typically refer to as digital transformation, and in the context of business specifically, really what we're talking about here is a revolution in the way consumers, business partners, employees, how we as people, especially in a business context, have evolved in the way we engage and the way we interact. It's enabled by the use of our typical digital channels, the web, mobile, and social, and it's intended to drive a level of productivity and improvement in end-user experience, and really drive an overall performance and drive value into how businesses interact with customers and vice versa. With that, when we look at basic human behavior, and this is an interesting depiction of that. This is what is less of a purchasing life cycle, less of an interaction life cycle. I'd like to call it a commitment life cycle, where we go from learning to validating to deciding, using, and committing. I mean, these are the sort of the natural steps that we take in making a decision to commit to something, and which ultimately then translates to a level of engagement. It translates, if the interaction is proved to be positive, it translates to a level of loyalty, and in a business context, it then translates to a monetizable investment, a value creation, an investment, an interaction that is essentially deemed valuable for both parties, both from the customer perspective, but also from the business perspective. Now, the interesting thing is that this hasn't really changed for as long as we can, we go back to sort of caveman days to today, and you'll see that the tools for conducting business has evolved dramatically over that time. While our behavior hasn't really changed fundamentally, the tools that we've used, from caveman drawings to, interestingly, the Mesopotamian tablet that you see out there from 3000 BC, fast forward to 5,000 years later, and we now have a tablet, the digital tablet, a digital device. And so the means by which we conduct and this interaction occurs has changed, but the fundamentals of human behavior themselves has not. So if we take that now and map it to a business context, in a typical corporation and structure of a corporation, we have, first off, the vision and leadership, and that is paramount for anything disruptive, especially something like digital. And if we break that down into the core areas, sales and marketing, product and operations, service, etc., these are by no means exhaustive, of course, but they intended to highlight some of the key elements of a corporation, along with the support functions, finance, IT, HR, etc. These are some of the key elements of how business gets done and the piece parts thereof. But if we look at digital and how it impacts these areas, certainly some of those areas are more impacted than others. And I'd say it's more so that they are perhaps areas that are more easily monetizable with digital, and or areas that have already been capitalized and exploited with digital more effectively. And so these are kind of the areas that we talk about as we move forward during the presentation as well. The key areas of investment that corporations have made using digital to help drive performance using these core levers. In the area of sales and marketing, we've seen web sales, mobile applications, social media, your typical e-commerce type interaction, e-commerce transactions, interactions with mobile applications, social media, etc. Those tend to be very heavily digital-centric investments for corporations. Product and operations, the nature of personalization, where you're able to configure a product or a service in a manner that is unique to the extent possible to the behavior and the characteristics of the customer, is something that is really enabled pretty effectively with digital. From a service perspective, and this is very critical, the nature of interactions with customers, given that a large majority of those tend to fall within a sort of a self-similar pattern, where you're typically transacting or you're typically interacting for a reason that's not terribly unlike another customer of similar segment, product purchases, etc. The digital becomes a very powerful tool to automate, to improve, and to make more effective these transactions from a service perspective. So if we look at the key levers or the key forces of transformation, the three channels, mobile, web, and social, are extremely important because they provide a level of connectivity for the customer back into the resources that are then driven by other technologies like cloud and analytics to be able to support a sort of a data-centric view of the world. Something that's mutually beneficial both for the corporation, because you're now serving or interacting with your customer in a way that is meaningful to them, meaningful and monetizable for you, and conversely, for the customer, from a customer perspective, it becomes an interaction that is monetizable, or I should say valuable, deemed valuable for the customer as they interact with the corporation. If we look at the impact of digital across the business landscape, it's clearly non-uniform. There are winners, and then they're losers. If we look at the winner circle, so to speak, we've seen technologies and players focused on video streaming, telematics, e-banking, clearly very digital-centric type businesses that have really proliferated and really benefited from the impact and growth in digital. Other corporations really still focused on legacy business models around brick and mortar stores, paper type magazines, DVD rentals, etc. These are the businesses who have been under tremendous pressure to morph, to evolve to a model that's digital centric, that makes them, that will ensure their continued viability going forward. So if we look at the digital landscape across both telecom as well as the rest of the other sectors, it's an interesting comparison. So looking across a few of the few notable ones: healthcare, banking, retail, and then we'll do a comparison against telecom. From a healthcare perspective, clearly a very large industry, 6.5 trillion actually in revenues in 2012. Some of the key sector-specific challenges that they've faced include basically a cost barrier for basic medical services. This is perhaps more true in developing nations, but certainly an important barrier. And limited access to specialty care, complex post-operative procedures, and the notion of having to go physically visit a medical resource, a doctor, in an area that may not be accessible, as an example. So there are certain barriers here that digital has really helped enable with things like telemedicine, etc. And so it is an important lever for the healthcare industry, and they've continued to exploit that over the last couple of years. If we look at banking, the notion of a physical bank and the need for a certain level of branch density across, for example, the United States, in order to serve customers, there's certainly some value to that, and there's certainly the notion of the human relationship. However, we've also seen a proliferation of e-banking, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And that's become something that's very important as an investment within the financial sector. Retail is clearly a leader in this space, driven in large part by the notion of convenience, price demands, etc., but also this notion of a variety-seeking behavior. Customers like to be able to compare and like to have choices, but not have to go walk from one store to another, and so on and so forth. So the physical retail channel has become, to some extent, cost prohibitive, and we've seen many an example of the level of disruption that's occurred in retail, but also the level of adoption in digital in retail as a result. So it's a bit of a shining star, I'd say, on the topic of digital. Telecom, on the other hand, is trying to follow suit. We've seen the high cost of a retail network and a retail presence across the country, anywhere between 4,000 to 6,000 to 8,000 stores across the country, and then the notion of not just the physical cost, the labor cost, the commissions impact. There's certainly a notion of margin pressure that's starting to impact the telecom business, especially within the carrier space, driven in large part by the commoditization of access services and the resulting margin pressure that's come from that. If we look across those same sectors today, as we see where they're headed, we've seen significant investments from a healthcare perspective in mobile health, as we talked about before. From a banking perspective, online banking has really started to take off. And then from a retail perspective, e-commerce has been a big driver. The revenue projections for healthcare in particular, $4.5 billion, trending toward $23 billion from mobile healthcare over the next 5 years. That is a significant growth perspective. The same thing is true for banking as well as retail, and you'll see in the case of retail, essentially a doubling in about the next 5 years, and that trend has continued even prior to 2013. So it's a pretty significant story. From a telecom perspective, we'll start to see a lot of investments in several areas in digital. From a sales and service perspective, really focused on building a really enticing user experience using the digital channel to drive growth, both from a sales and service perspective. And as a result, also marrying the different channels that exist today into an omni-channel environment. And by that, I mean the ability to interact with one channel and either initiate a transaction in one channel, complete it in the other, and vice versa, and also use the channels in a holistic way such that from a customer perspective, it essentially feels like all those endpoints are coordinated, and when I interact with Corporation X, it's no different whether I interact with a channel A, B, C, D, or E. And that the notion of that omni-channel capability is very important in this data-centric model. From a progress perspective, we've seen several targets anywhere between 50% of transactions online all the way up to 95%. Some lofty goals, no doubt, but certainly the right ones. But although at the same time, we have seen some initial failed attempts in execution, not terribly unlike any corporation or industry or sector really trying to make a play in a disruptive market. But nevertheless, there's definitely, we've noticed an ongoing and sustained investment strategy in digital within telecom. Now let's take a different view. Let's take the consumer view and the notion of a digital consumer. The consumer today has really evolved into, a person who is sophisticated and really is able to use the different elements of digital that's around us all the time. Here we'll talk a little bit about some of the trends that we have seen, which is driven really by a snapshot from the 2013 edition of Deloitte's Global Mobile Consumer Survey, which provides a level of insight into consumer behavior, purchasing habits, preferences, etc. Essentially, this measures the sentiment across a broad range of mobile services and technologies and devices. It's a pretty interesting study because it actually gathers data from about 20 countries, including the United States, of course. And it actually represents 38,000 consumers around the world, 2,000 specifically from the United States. So it's a very telling and very powerful way to really understand what this consumer sentiment look like around the topic of digital, specifically in smartphone, tablet adoption, and so on and so forth. This year's survey, by the way, will launch in the fall, and so we'll have an opportunity to get a refresh of how that's trending on a year-over-year basis. But specifically, if we look at the data from the survey, it shows that tablet growth is skyrocketing amongst 25 to 34-year-olds. Now, not entirely surprising. It's about a 74% growth year-over-year. Whereas in the 55 plus segment, they had about 45% growth. So across the board, both from a tablet perspective as well as from a smartphone perspective, we see sustained year-over-year device penetration growth for tablets and smartphones. So that's important because that's an indicator, an enabler of how customers are using digital to interact, to transact with corporations today. And the good news is that saturation is still far away in terms of dual ownership. We noticed that in 2013, only 22% of smartphone, there was only about 22% customers who actually owned both a smartphone and a tablet simultaneously. So, and clearly those two have a distinction in terms of their use and the level of use, etc. And so, what it indicates is that there's yet more growth ahead of us in this space. The other important angle about customer behavior is that it's no longer linear. There's a lattice of influences in digital. And by that we mean, if we think about the level of connectivity, the customer now has sort of this notion of 24/7 connectivity. So there's constant connectivity through smart devices, etc., to really inform their decision making. So that the level of information coming at them, customized for them, is continuing to grow, number one. Number two, there's also this notion of constant social connectivity. Not only is information coming from corporations and that sort of an interaction, but it's also coming from a social perspective, from their peer group, from their friends, family circles, etc. So the notion of there's a notion of clustering, if I may, and that's probably minimizes the word, but really there's this notion of decision making that's really influenced by a peer group set that's becoming increasingly powerful, which again makes the social element of this extremely important. And then, of course, there's the behavioral connectivity, where there's a level of insight into what customers are doing and when and where and why. And that information becomes very powerful when corporations look to interact with customers. And so the confluence of these influencing drivers really drive down into the funnel that pulls together the notion of, what is it that customers will decide to do? They're connected, they're informed, they're active. And so as they make decisions, there's this confluence of drivers that come together in the decisions that they make. Some of the key activities that have evolved as a result of digital. So if we look at the pre-digital world, from a communications perspective, SMS used to be the most important factor in how customers communicated and the primary means of doing so. Whereas today, you basically have customers with digital on a 24/7 watch, essentially, on connectivity. From a healthcare perspective, we've moved from medical records in paper and hard drive, or I should say we are moving rapidly away from that, to this notion of remote monitoring and the ability to store data electronically and the ability to monitor your vitals essentially 24/7. Fitness has taken off in a pretty big way from a digital perspective, whereas before we used to have manual tracking, paper pencil, to now what has ended up being the personalized fitness programs and really the ability to collaborate and share information through social networks and a whole host of wearable devices that really help you monitor and track your progress towards your fitness goals, et cetera, et cetera. And then media, of course, where we've seen an evolution, a pretty rapid evolution, I'd say, from physical media, DVDs, print, et cetera, to this notion of anytime, anywhere consumption, place shifted, time shifted, and device agnostic. And the ability to consume content in various formats for wherever you are and at any time you want. So clearly digital has really helped us evolve the way customers interact across the different industries. Looking at your traditional customer lifecycle, that too has seen a pretty significant evolution. If you look at it from this lens, the learning period used to be word of mouth, mass media communication through TV ads, et cetera. And frankly, word of mouth was a significant factor. Today, any purchase we make includes a review of websites and perhaps even a testing of a decision with the peer group within social media. And if we look at the numbers, they're pretty staggering. With digital today, we've seen 81% of customers gather information for a period of 79 days on average for a major purchase. That is a staggering level of research, but that is also a staggering level of influence that digital has on consumer purchasing behavior, especially for significant purchases. It shows a level of trust that consumers have in the connectivity that they're using with digital and the interaction they're having with others using digital in order to make these decisions around purchasing, or even within the learning stage. From a buy perspective, comparison shopping, digital stores again have made a significant influence in how customers buy. And we've seen that 10% of retail sales will be online, but within 60% will evolve to the web by 2017. Again, a significant growth factor. From a service perspective, and this is very important, natural language, self-help, live chat, troubleshooting, these are all important factors in service, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But service is a very important indicator because it is typically a interaction that is typically originated by the customer. And today we see 31% of all customer service interactions were through the web in 2013. That's an important stat, and we expect that number to grow significantly over the next few years. And then, of course, expansion, notion of personalized shopping, recommendations, internet-only offers. It's staggering to think that 25% of all sales at one of the leading online retailers in the United States, and in fact, if not globally, came from personalized recommendations. That is an indicator of the power of the power of digital, social, mobile, web, but also the power of the supporting data-centric modeling coming from cloud and analytics. And that's the level of personalization that you can deliver to your end customer using digital technology. Now let's look at the telecom sector specifically and the trends in the industry. Clearly, telecom operators are starting to see digital as a key driver of growth. In fact, 31% of all mobile devices were purchased online in 2012. That is a staggering growth factor from where we were just a few years ago. There are other factors, of course. There's $10 billion spent on leading app stores in 2013, and about $5.9 billion of global digital music revenues in 2013, a 5% year-over-year growth. While some of these are not directly impacting the growth of the financials of a wireless operator, clearly it's an indication of customer behavior, purchasing patterns, and as a result, growth drivers for telecom operators. And as a result of some of these trends, the telecom operators are clearly making significant investments in digital. From a B2C perspective, whereas only about 7% or so of telecom sales originated through the digital channel back in 2013, we're expecting that number to grow to about 60% in the next 3 years. For B2B, that number is expected to grow from 15% last year to about 80% in 2016. So clearly there is a significant investment and push within the telecom sector across a multitude of corporations that we have interacted with as well, really looking to leverage the digital channel and do away with the high-touch customer model that frankly is becoming less attractive and less profitable for many organizations. Telecom investments in digital are clearly today what we have seen is really focused on sales and service, those being so the market-facing drivers. From a sales objectives perspective, it makes sense because there's a level of customer targeting that is far more precise with digital. And the ability to personalize offers for customers is very powerful. The acquisition of customers also becomes far more automated, both from which is effective both from a telecom perspective, corporation perspective, but also from a customer perspective. This ultimately results in reduction in acquisition costs, commissions, etc. And then on the service side, the use of digital is really intended to improve customer satisfaction and reduce costs, right? To actually improve EBITDA and get the unnecessary costs or costs that can be steered away from your typical current call center model and really move toward a digital-centric interaction model. We've listed out some of the key capabilities within digital, going from basic all the way to leading. You'll see the basic things are the ability to register, manage your profile, but frankly be able to transact new orders, accessory orders, etc. So the simple things within the telecom environment. Moving up that chain, the ability to include BYOD orders, so essentially only buying a SIM in the case of wireless, but also being able to upgrade to new devices, to new equipment, new service, the ability to make bill payments regardless of the type of service you provide, you're purchasing, and also the ability to personalize your experience depending on your purchasing behavior, depending on your social profile, et cetera, being able to have the telecom corporation interact with the customer across the multitude of channels that have now become prevalent for the customer. Moving up that chain to an advanced state where click-to-chat, account management, and frankly more specifically the notion of user analytics and the notion of social media integration, really being able to build a precise interaction type for a given customer is really very powerful, and it's a trend that we're starting to see take root. Then, of course, ultimately for now, the notion of preemptive service and the ability to conduct video billing, which we start to see happen as well. And really the ability to interact through the digital channel with what is seemingly a digital representation of a service agent, a virtual agent, who can basically interact and respond in a manner that is more efficient for the customer and is deemed preferential, and something that is deemed valuable. And frankly, it's a win-win because both the customer is happy, has the question answered. It's a precise model, but at the same time, have the corporation be able to leverage that type of technology, even if they have to supplement it with manual intervention in the back end. Be able to manage that triaging appropriately can be very powerful and can be very impactful within the value chain. If we look at digital and sales and service for telecom companies, it's really focused on revenue, margins, and customer experience. From a revenue growth perspective, we now have the notion of a interaction that is, or a store that is open 24 hours. You can log on anytime, and you can interact anytime. The ability to launch new products very quickly is clearly a significant advantage. And the ability to draw on positive product recommendations, be able to provide a analytics-based model for product recommendations, really allows the tailoring of services and products for customers, which is very impactful from both sides. Of course, the important piece here is that the fast reaction to competitive moves, that's an important element because that is a double-edged sword. So as fast as you can move into digital and make changes and make it a dynamic medium by which you interact with customers, monetize merchandise, etc., that same advantage holds for your customers as well, for your competitors as well. And so that's an important dynamic that needs to be taken into consideration. The reality is that's the level of competition is essentially increased when you play in the digital space. And if you don't, you're significantly disadvantaged. From a margin perspective, reduction in cost to care clearly is a significant driver. Deflection to digital is an important element. Of course, with the other elements that come with it, real estate, inventory costs, etc. And the notion of being able to optimize your labor costs for a digital-centric interaction model with customers, and ultimately be able to steer demand to more profitable channels. And that ought to be a deliberate decision that corporations make as opposed to one that's forced upon them. From a customer experience perspective, the ability to provide the latest products, pre-orders even, and really shorten the transaction time. Oftentimes, we've seen the notion of customers wanting to come in, make a very specific purchase, but the retail channel, as an example, not to pick on retail, but just as an example, can sometimes be a bit of a bottleneck. Whereas within the digital channel, assuming servers are up and the channel is up and running, it becomes a very automated, very simplified, and very, very rapid transaction and easy to use channel for interaction and transacting. And so the notion of no wait time, always on engagement is very powerful within digital. So these are sort of the three key buckets: revenue growth, margins, better margins, and customer experience, as we've seen as sort of the key drivers where telecom companies are making investments in sales and service to really optimize around these three elements. With that, Kyle, we can open it up to questions.
All right, thanks, Ganesha. Yeah, we had quite a few questions come in, so we'll just start. The first one is, what are some of the pitfalls companies should be aware of as they make their entry into digital?
That's actually a great question. Thank you, Kyle, for that. So I think there's several key pitfalls, and I think the one that comes up most often is channel conflict. So how do companies manage the transition? And the key word is transition from their current channel model to one that is digital centric, and that involves a fundamental plan, a fundamental shift from how companies do business today It requires a level of thoughtfulness on how do you support the existing traditional channels with commissions, etc., while you make investments in digital before, over a period of time, as you train your customer base, you transition to a more digital-centric model. And it also allows you to steer as you should. If you need to steer faster or slower, you're able to do that when you're essentially supporting a dual model, at least for a period of time. The other part of that is really the notion of being able to train your customers and really be patient. I mean, there needs to be, incentives and deterrents in this. Customers, may be comfortable with digital in general, but may not necessarily be comfortable with transacting over digital within the telecom space. Now that is an opportunity, because when you create the right level of incentives that still allow for a profitable interaction with the corporation, that's powerful. And when you create the right level of deterrence and essentially entice customers to move to what should be, and the keyword should be, a more attractive means by which to interact with a corporation, that's powerful. And that's what ultimately will drive adoption. And the one thing I called out earlier around service, and this is why service is very important. As sort of a rule of thumb, we always recommend starting with service, because it's sort of a push from the customer. The customers have to interact with you. Make that a pleasurable interaction through digital before you then bring in sales to supplement that.
Great. The next question we had come in. In your opinion, is the carrier subsidization of handsets holding back the digital adoption in telecom?
That's a great question. I think there's definitely a significant trend that we're seeing around subsidization models. I'm not actually sure that it's actually holding back digital. If anything, I'd say the handset subsidization model is probably a driver toward digital, simply because we all know the economics of handset subsidies, and it has a pretty significant impact on the carrier P&L. Digital helps shore that up to some extent. It's not going to recover the cost of the subsidy itself, but what it does provide is a level by which you can start to recover some of your margin through a channel that is effectively more profitable compared to your traditional brick and mortar.
Great. Next question coming in. What are some of the reasons why telecom companies have continued to lag in digital?
That's a great question, actually. Some of it is it's interesting. So some of it is that there's a natural apprehension, because the model is essentially has always been deemed to be working, so to speak. So if it ain't broken, don't fix it. Now, the challenge with that model is that by the time you find out that it's broken, it's too late, because your competitors have moved on much faster, and within telecom, we're talking multi-billion-dollar companies, tens of, sometimes hundreds of billion-dollar companies. For them to make a move into any space is going to take time. It's a significant level of inertia. And so, some of that is definitely the notion of things that it's the perception of things that are working, so why change it right away? So there's for that. And the other part of that is planning and execution. When not sequenced right, and we've seen examples of that, when investments in digital are not sequenced right, and you don't necessarily build the right environment for customers to interact via digital, then you basically get to a situation where when and if you steer, or you oversteer in that case, to digital, you can end up with a really poor customer experience, which can be disastrous, and then sort of creates a deterrent for the corporation to continue to make investments in that space. And we've heard that and seen that on multiple occasions. But in reality, I think today, while we have lagged, I'd say there's broad-based acceptance that this is the model going forward. So everyone is basically moving in that direction at differing paces, in sometimes in slightly different directions with different targets. But generally speaking, we definitely see the momentum shift in the right direction toward digital. Back to you, Kyle.
Great. So kind of on average, how long does it take for a corporation to transform from a traditional model into a digital centric one?
That actually is a good question, but short answer, and I hate to provide to sound this way, but it really varies. And I'd even say it's not about how long. It's actually the bigger question is how you do it and how you sequence it. It comes down to can you and how quickly can you build an attractive destination so that customers want to interact with you in a digital fashion. I think that is a bigger question. And making sure that you're building the small wins as you go through this journey is very important. We talked about service. We talked about specific elements. Part of it is building the trust of the customer as you start to interact with them digitally, and they see that as a very viable, if not, frankly, more attractive way to interact with the corporation. But also internally, as you make investments in digital, you want broad-based support for it, and that is an important driver. When you start to see early wins with what we call reasonable targets and have that scale, it's very powerful, especially as you hit sort of the high cost channels. You start to really see value to the business as we move and steer towards digital in a thoughtful way.
Great.
Back to you.
In the current and near future state of the industry, can mobile operators meet the needs of the industry capacity, or do you see it as going to be a significant bottleneck?
That's an interesting question. It's almost a little bit, I'd say, adjacent to the digital conversation, and let me maybe contextualize it. Ultimately, when we get into what's driving demand, well, it's what's going to be driving demand is the consumption of data, consumption of mobile applications, content, video, etc. And so that's essentially the demand driver coming in. The supply constraint ultimately becomes spectrum. And so the use of spectrum and spectrum technology and how do we device, how do we offload to Wi-Fi, for example, to unlicensed spectrum, and essentially how do we improve the spectral efficiency of connectivity is what is ultimately going to drive the answer to that question. Now, my own perspective on that is I think we will start to see a significant shift. And we continue to see a significant shift to offloaded licenses, so offloaded technology like Wi-Fi as an example. We're starting to see some of that already. But also, I think we'll continue to see a level of there's going to be, from a policy perspective, we'll continue to see a continued evolution of freeing up the airwaves, so to speak, so that there's enough spectrum out there for the efficiencies that exist today. But ultimately, I do believe that there will be also the evolution of coding algorithms, because I think the level of spectral efficiency that we can get from what we're doing right now can certainly be improved. And antenna technology gets into the details of hardware design. All of those and the ability to utilize spectrum far more efficiently for a given channel or for a given connection ultimately will answer that question. So my short answer is it's an ongoing discussion and ongoing debate, not one that when it gets to if you speak to the engineer and the physicist, it's not a burning question. Let's put it that way. It's certainly a economics question, which is the cost of spectrum and the impact it has on overall business is clearly important, and that's more where the question lies more than anywhere else.
Great. Kind of I guess this kind of goes hand in hand a little bit with the previous question, but is there an end state to digital, or in other words, is there an overall budget expectation that corporations should be looking at when investing in digital?
Yeah, I think the short answer to the notion of an end state in digital is, the short answer is no. I think one of the things that we've used as sort of a benchmark, if I may, based on our experience across a multitude of different corporations is, we typically see a foreseeable, and the key word is foreseeable, investment hurdle of about, let's say, $20 million to really get a channel up and running in digital from virtually nothing. So we get to that point, and that sort of gets you the intermediate capability, if I may. Beyond that, if digital becomes the primary means by which corporations operate, well, then that's going to be an important area of investment on an ongoing basis. As we start to see other technologies come together around digital, for example, wearable computing, analytics, all those pieces coming together, these are going to result in ongoing investments in digital, which are going to be, which basically means that we expect that corporations will continue to invest in this space over time. But short answer that is no. We don't see it as an end state. We actually see that as really this is the operating model going forward.
Great. What has the experience been in integrating digital front end with telecom operations and business support systems?
Could you ask the question again?
Yeah. What has the experience been in integrating digital front end with telecom operations and business support systems?
It's an excellent question, and one word is painful. It's very painful, and there's a whole host of reasons for that. One way to put it is that it's not so much a challenge of integrating digital front end with OSS BSS and frankly the billing system. It's about integrating anything with the billing system. The complexity lies right there. There's been many a model that's been discussed, and there's many sort of transient models, if I may, to compensate for the level of complexity that is required with that integration. And we've seen, and frankly, we have in some cases even recommended a interim model where there's a level of manual intervention and offline intervention that is essentially opaque to the customer. And so the customer really doesn't know that that's what's occurring. They believe they're interacting on a real-time basis with a digital channel. But as you go through the phased approach to a fully automated digital channel, we've seen corporations, and we've actually made those recommendations, where corporations have essentially introduced a manual step in the back end in order to ensure appropriate data is entered into the billing system and vice versa, and information is sent back. So it's an ongoing journey. My sense is that a level of simplification will need to result and expect we will see some of that in the next 5 years or so, especially as we see companies start to move away from subsidies and so on and so forth, and see the decoupling of essentially the handset, the device from service plans. We should expect to see a level, and that's specifically to wireless, but we should expect to see a level of simplification over time within the OSS BSS, which should, at least to some extent, start to make that combination and integration a little bit easier.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions. Do you see higher or lower profit margins in telecom companies in the short-term future?
Well, it depends on let's talk about the U.S. market for a second. If we look at the U.S. market, and if we look at some of the plays being made within the carrier space, for example, I think there are two sort of competing factors. One is the move away from handset subsidies should basically shore up margins. On the other hand, the investments that are coming into the telecom sector within telecom operator market from outside the United States, as an example, suggests that moves could be made to make the level of competitiveness really very different, and a price-based competitive model may become more prevalent in the short term. So you have this notion of these competing factors. Net, I expect to see margins come down a little bit over the next few years before they stabilize and hopefully go back up again. I think the short-term drivers are going to be what I just described as an evolution to a model not unlike what we've seen in Europe, not unlike what we've seen in Asia, where the margins are a lot thinner than they are here in the United States. Now, with that said, there are also a lot more products and services coming in with all sorts of different levels of connectivity, with in-car connectivity and wearable computing and every possible means of connection with M2M, etc. We see those as new new investments and new sources of revenue. But net, that's still about 3-4 years out before we see any kind of uptick there. In the short term, though, I do expect to see a downward trend in margin.
Okay, finally, Ganesha, if anyone has any specific questions or ideas, can they reach out to you directly?
Yes, absolutely. I just pulled up the my contact information. Email is probably the best way to reach me. I'm always happy to take questions, connect, and we can talk about digital and talk about how we can help. Happy to connect.
Okay, great. For anyone that we didn't get to their questions, I will be sure to forward those questions on to Ganesha for follow-up. And in that, I want to thank everyone for attending Digital Transformation, a bitwise evolution for the telecommunications industry, presented by Deloitte. And I want to thank our presenter, Ganesha Rasia, Senior Manager, Telecommunications, Media, and Technology at Deloitte Consulting. Thank you, Ganesha.
Thank you, everyone.